The beam found me miles from shore, and it didn't blink. It knew exactly where I was in the dark. I fish alone when the weather turns, because the bay empties and the traps down to get poached. That night, the storm rolled in earlier than the forecast wind hard from the east. Rain like gravel, the kind of cold that bites your wrists where your sleeves ride up. The channel markers vanished into black, and the only thing left to navigate by was the dead hulking silhouette of Caldwell Light on the headland. It's been decommissioned since before I was born. No cower, no keeper, no beam. Just a rusted spine of stairs and a clouded glass crown. I had the engine at a nervous idle, counting seconds between lightning, when a blade of white cut the water in front of me. Not lightning steady, surgical. It swung, slow at first, then quick, and it pinned me like a stage light. My wheelhouse went bleached and flat. Every rivet in the boat threw a shadow. I put a hand up and felt heat on my skin, a sunburn in a straight line. I keyed the radio, but it was all needles of static. The depth sounder froze, a gray smudge. The beam tracked when I moved. I nudged the throttle, and it followed, keeping me lit while rain hammered the deck and wind tried to shove me sideways. A part of me wanted to gun it and outrun the light, like you can outrun something that swiveled with your heartbeat. But the other part of me was old fisherman superstition. If a light is on, you respect it. So I let it guide me, or pretend I was letting it. It never swept past me to mark rocks. It never looked away to show me safe water. It just held me. When I finally nosed between the moorings, the beam flicked off, like a switch. 1 second I was a pinned moth. The next I was blind in totaled night. Ghost images burned into my eyes. I docked mostly by memory and feel. By the time I got the lines on, the wind had gone dead, as if someone had turned the storm down. The lighthouse on the headland sat black and simple, a dressmaker's dummy against the clouds. I didn't sleep. I scrolled my phone, trying to see if I'd caught any video out there. I hadn't recorded a thing, but every photo on my phone, every photo had changed. A pale wedge of glare slashed across them, like someone had dragged a hot wire through the pixels. Birthdays, the old picture of my dad in his work boots. A selfie in front of the bait shack. In some, the wedge cut right through my face. In others, it ran along the horizon like a leveled spirit line. The newest shot of my boat, taken a week ago at noon, had a seam of white burned straight through the wheelhouse window. Morning came brittle and harmless. I told myself I'd been primed by adrenaline, that the phone thing was some glitch, that the beam had been a trick of rain and distant shore lights. I took the skiff out anyway. It's a short run to Caldwell Light, a rocky little spur with gulls that work the wind like they're on wires. The place is fenced off by a crooked chain link, but no one patrols. A keep out sign, bleached pale, stares the same as it has for years. Inside the tower, the air tasted like wet pennies and cold stone. My boots echoed up the spiral. Halfway, the wind bellowed through a seam and pushed my breath back into my mouth. At the final landing, the door to the lantern room stopped me. Where hinges should have been, there were straps of steel welded straight across the frame. The welds bubbled an orange-brown with age. Someone had burned those beads on with an old stick welder a long time ago and never looked back. There was no getting through without a grinder and a generator. "Hey!" A voice below startled me so bad I thought my heart would walk down the stairs and leave me there. A man in a V-neck windbreaker and a volunteer badge stood at the first curve, craning up. "You can't be in here." We ended halfway on the stairs and negotiated truce. He was from the Historical Society, came sometimes to make sure the place didn't fall into the sea. I told him what I'd seen. He gave me a look people reserve for fishermen, drunks, and anyone using the words, "I'm telling you." "Lantern room's been sealed since the 80s, he said. "No power to the lens. They pulled the lines, cut the circuit. You can see that." He gestured toward the dead conduit. Nothing up there to throw a light. I showed him my phone. He swiped through my photos, each one branded with that same cold wedge. His mouth tightened. He didn't have a theory. Nothing up there was all he had. I didn't go back to the boat that night. I sat in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and packaging tape and tried to convince myself that ordinary light can do strange things through bottles, across water, between panes of old glass. But after sunset, a sliver of white crept along the far wall. It had no source. It arrived like fog. When I stood, it rose, aligning with my chest. It was thin as a carpenter's chalk line, but bright enough to throw a breath-long shadow behind the pepper grinder. I shut off every light. The white line stayed. I pulled the curtains. It came through the gap at the seam. It waited on me. When I lifted my phone, the camera app opened to a field of white. Not blown-out blackness white, with the faint suggestion of curved glass, a net of brass, a rim the color of old oil. I tilted the phone left, and the white arc tilted back as if on a pivot. There was a sound under it, too. A low, patient whir. If you've ever heard a big lens rotate, you know there's a rhythm to it, not fast, not slow, something that feels like it could turn forever. I went back out. I don't know why. Call it the fisherman part again, the part that wants to lay eyes on the thing rather than let your head build it into a bigger thing. The headland was darker than ink. The tower was a colder shadow in that dark. The welded door at the top looked like a scar. The beam didn't show from outside. The night had no stripe. But as I stepped inside, the air warmed along one side of my face. On the stairs, the white line slid over the stone in a perfect circle. It didn't come from above or below. It just kept to me, to my height, like it remembered where my shoulders were and refused to slip. Half a turn up, I heard a knock from the sealed door, 6 times measured and human. I barked out, "Who's there?" and immediately felt stupid for giving the line something to answer. The answer was a hum that grew into a presence behind the door. The sense of large glass moving in a place where no glass should move. The light on the wall swung an inch to the right, then stopped. My phone in my pocket got hot as if someone had pressed a lamp against the case. I took it out and saw the latest photo autosaved. Me, on the stair, lit hard from above and behind, one eye whited out. The timestamp said 2 minutes in the future. I didn't to run because running on spiral iron in the dark is a good way to never have the chance to tell anyone why you did it. I went down slow, and the beam went down with me, holding me steady as if I were the one that might crash. Outside, sea spray felt warm where the line cut through it. Back home, every picture frame on my wall had a pale diagonal. My grandfather's face was bisected by light that hadn't been there yesterday. A childhood snapshot of me on the pier. Now there was a small, perfect wedge aiming from the distant headland, straight to where I stood with my paper cone of fries. I keep the curtains taped. I turned the mirrors to the wall. It doesn't matter. After midnight, there's always a little leak of white that finds the seam under the door and climbs, slow, until it rests across my chest where my heart beats loudest. Sometimes it knocks, 6 times, from nowhere I can point to. People say decommissioned means dead, but the thing about a light is it doesn't need to sweep to do its job. It can hold steady, it can wait. And I think that's what it's doing now, waiting very patiently for me to step closer. The horn wasn't warning ships. It was calling me by a name only my father used when he was alive. Fog owns this town some nights. It comes early and thick, and the lights on the pier go dull like someone smeared thumbprints over every bulb. I was closing up the bait shack when the first blast rolled in from breakwater point deep and round, the old diaphone horn that lives in the concrete shed under the lighthouse. It's the kind of sound you feel in your ribs. It rattled the buckets on the shelf and sent a tremor through the counter under my palms. I've heard that horn all my life. My father worked traps out past the point and swore the sound saved him more than once. 5 years ago, he went out ahead of a storm and never came back. They found his boat with the bow rope chewed like it had tried to climb the sea. After that, I started hearing the horn differently, like a memory you can't control. This time, underneath the round note, something rode along. I was halfway to locking the door when I realized the horn had said my full name in my father's voice. First and middle, the way he'd call if I wandered too close to the winch. I stood there, hand on the key, letting cold come up through my shoes. The horn sounded again after a measured lull, low and huge, and beneath it, clear as if he were standing behind me. Step closer. I backed into a stack of minnow traps. My first, stupid thought was that someone was playing a recording as a joke. YouTube prank, radio bleed, something with a new app. I grabbed my phone, hit the voice memo button, and stepped outside. The fog was wet wool. It softened the edges off the world. You lose distance in it. The rope handrail leading down the pier beaded up with water, each drop holding a streetlight upside down. The horn spoke again from the point, a long animal note, and under it my father rough from cigarettes, warmed by the way he said my name when he wanted me to listen. Step closer. I called out, because that's what you do when you're hoping you'll be embarrassed, instead of frightened. Who is that? The fog gave my voice right back with a little delay that made me sound like I didn't believe myself. The marina radio on the counter cracked to life with a burst of static. I jumped. You good over there? Joey from the harbor office. This stuff's thick. Yeah, I said. I almost told him. I didn't. Just shutting down. I dug foam earplugs from the drawer. The bright orange kind you roll thin. I shoved them deep. I went out anyway. If a sound won't leave you alone, you go meet it. That is what my father taught me about engines and weather and men. Understand it up close before it gets the drop on you. The breakwater is a spine of stone and concrete that knifes into the bay. On calm days, you can walk it and feel taller than the town. In fog, it's a blind path with the sea breathing on both sides. The horn lives at the end, in a squat blockhouse with a rusted door and a single porthole like an eye. I made it halfway before the next blast. With the plugs in, the air didn't roar as hard, but something else happened. The railing under my hand talked. It vibrated in a rhythm that wasn't random, and the message came straight into my bones. Not into my ears, into me. Step closer. I squeezed the rope until tar smeared my palm. My feet wanted to move. The fog thinned for a second, and I saw the dark shape of the point ahead. The lighthouse itself is skeletal, no keeper there. Not for 50 years, but the Foghorn still runs when visibility tanks. Usually the note is just a comfort, a heartbeat. That night it was a mouth. The last 10 yards, the concrete went slick. I felt cold come through my soles, so hard the arches of my feet cramped. The horn blasted again. The little bones in my wrists hummed against the rail. My father's cadence slid through the metal, slow and patient. He used to call to me from the stern like that when I was learning knots. Step closer. The door to the horn room was locked, a fat rusted padlock that had not been disturbed in a long time. I put my face to the porthole and saw only darkness and a suggestion of bulk, a hulking outline where the trumpet sat. The glass was sweat slick on the inside, with condensation that ran in tracks like clear handwriting. As I watched, the beads formed 2 words and began to drag down. Step closer. Dad, I said. My breath fogged the porthole. For a moment, there was heat against my cheek, like a palm. I took out my phone and thumbed the memo app. The screen pulsed with a flat white line, waiting to turn into sound. The horn let loose. The line fattened. My name trembled through the concrete under my boots. I leaned toward the porthole without meaning to. The sea on the other side of the wall sucked at the rocks with that greedy sound it makes, the one that says it can take anything at any time. Step closer. The words rode through the building frame. They had the weight of a habit. He used to stand with one foot braced, rope across his thigh, and say it over the engine noise. Step closer. Learn where to stand. Don't make the boat find you. A darker patch moved inside the room. Nothing I could define, just a sense that something leaned nearer on the other side of the glass. I put my hand on the porthole. The glass trembled like an animal trying to control its breathing. Behind me, out in the mist, water slapped concrete 3 times in a row like slow applause. I turned, just my head. The fog became its own wall. I'm not ashamed to say I thought about my father's body under it, floating somewhere past the point where the lighthouse stops caring. I thought about how the last thing he heard might have been that same horn, and how the note would have vibrated his bones too. I took my hand off the glass. My feet wouldn't back up on their own. I made them. I walked backward along the breakwater, feeling the rope saw at my palm, the tar sticky and familiar. The horn spoke once more behind me. The words came in a way I've never heard from a machine, like a smile that isn't kind. Step closer. Back at the shack, I shut the door and let the confusion and fear come after, in a private, clumsy way. I played the recording. The memo was almost silent. There was no deep horn, no voice, just a faint broadband hiss like a seashell. Then, under it, at the very edge of what my speakers could make, a breath of a man chuckling in a way that made my scalp climb. I sent the file to Joey anyway. He texted back, "Wind noise." The fog lifted by morning. I drove out to the point with coffee and a little bravado. The padlock on the horn room looked the same. The compressor gauge inside the side door visible through a crack read 0. The maintenance log hung in a plastic sleeve. The last entry, weeks old, said, "Line cut to prevent nuisance activation." I took a picture of that. The horn should not have been able to sound. I have that, at least something ordinary to stand next to the part I can't. Since that night, I hear it when the weather turns. The bathroom fan in my apartment drops an octave and bends my name around its bearings. The refrigerator kicks on and asks for one more step. The steel guardrail at the crossing hums a low note that turns into my father in the moment the train goes by. Earplugs don't matter. Noise-canceling headphones turn it into a pressure I feel in my teeth and spine, the way you feel a big ferry before you see it. I still work the pier. I still walk the breakwater on calm days. I leave when the fog piles in, because I know I'll want to listen, and I can't trust my feet. My phone sometimes shows a missed call from an unknown number at odd hours. When I play the voicemail, there's only a slow exhale in space, and something far away that breathes like a big instrument waiting for air. I don't tell many people. You get tired of proving you're not just grief in a jacket. This is the truth. The horn wasn't warning ships that night. It found a voice that mattered to me, and now it knows I hear it. On the nights when the fog presses the windows, I sit in the dark and feel the metal in the building wake up. The screws and rails and pipes, all lifting the same low note. And underneath my father, patient as ever, asking for the smallest thing. Step closer. The book knew the next thought before I did. The lighthouse only had to wait for me to catch up. I started volunteering at Hallowell Light because I grew up staring at it. It's the postcard for our Harbor White Tower, Black Lantern, polite little museum in the keeper's house with a gift shop that sells taffy and socks. On Thursdays, I wiped salt off the railing, scraped flaking paint, and acted like I knew what I was talking about when school groups asked how the lens worked. It was honest, quiet work. You can trust old metal and glass more than you can trust people. The keeper's office is staged like a photograph of the past. Big oak desk, blistered with age. A brass lamp that doesn't plug in anymore. On the desk, under glass, sits the logbook, thick, sea-swollen pages with a leather spine that still smells faintly of damp wool and vinegar from the iron gall ink. The entries stop in 1959, when they automated the light. According to the placard, June, the coordinator, asked if I'd help photograph and transcribe the log so they could put the pages online. She unlocked the case, set out white cotton gloves, and left me alone with a camera and a foam cradle. The office was cool. You could hear the wind baffle in the stovepipe and the sea marbles counting themselves on the rocks below. The smell of paper and salt was so clean it felt like a memory. The first pages were what you'd expect. Terse handwriting, dates, weather, a dry note about a ship standing off in fog, a complaint about coal delivery. The ink was brown now, stiff in the strokes. I worked slow, careful, trying not to breathe too hard over a century-old hand. On a page with a coffee ring the size of a saucer, I thought, without saying it out loud, I should skip this. I might smudge the ring. A new line appeared in the margin, as if it had always been there. Same ink, same stern hand, dry to the touch. He will skip the stained page. I took my hand off the paper, sudden and stupid, like it had snapped at me. The office was the same. The gulls made their complaining sounds outside. No one was in the doorway. The letters in the margin were not wet. When I slid a knuckle over them, there was no smear, no shine. If they were an old line, how had I not seen them a moment ago? The thought that followed, bright and dumb as a dropped penny, was, I won't tell June about this. She'll think I'm making a joke. The nib-straight writing glided into the next inch of blank paper, unhurried, inevitable. He will say nothing to June. I said no, aloud to the book or the room. I don't know. It didn't answer, because why would it need to? I flipped back 3 pages stopped, went forward again. The sentence was where it had been, and no later entries looked smudged or new. The new line had the same slight pressure variation, the same peculiar R the keeper used when he wrote the word barometer. Okay, I thought. Okay, think of something it can't anticipate. Think of a specific ugly thought I've never had and would never say. I won't repeat what I thought. I had the mean thing and the even meaner version of it half built in my mind when the book wrote, without hurrying. He will think something ugly to test me. The office didn't tilt, but my stomach did. I backed off the chair and let my gloved hands hang open. The air had a taste to it, then bitter, like the way batteries smell. I stepped away from the desk 3 paces and put the camera down as if it might be a weapon the book could use. The next line it wrote was pinned like a butterfly right where my eyes landed. He will go upstairs. No, I said again, but it wasn't the kind of no a person listens to. It is the no you say to an ocean before it takes your feet out from under you. I could have walked outside. I could have locked the office and handed June the keys. Instead, I took the narrow enclosed stair from the office to the tower, the one that becomes iron after the first turn. The cold that lives in lighthouse stairs is not like ordinary cold. It climbs your jeans, and inside your cuffs, a damp hand. The iron rail had a nick at chest height, where hundreds of rings must have rattled into it. At the first landing, I stopped. A thin draft came through a seam with a flute note in it. I hadn't decided to pause there. I looked back, angry at myself for obeying words written by a ghost of a man. On the page now, because I had brought the book with me without remembering picking it up, was the line, dry as every other. He will hesitate at the first landing. Who are you? I asked the book, cheeks hot and ridiculous. I set it down on the landing, on the flat of the step where the wind couldn't catch it. Some part of me wanted to see if it needed the weight of a hand to keep making the world line up. It didn't. The page remained open, and after a calm breath, the penless script inscribed more of itself. The strokes bit into the paper with the confidence of ink that knows it will not bleed. He will think about calling for help and decide he wanted to like the sound of his own voice in here. I climbed one turn, too. The lantern room above held its light like a closed eye. The sound in the column was only my shoes and a far-off tick, something cooling, something counting. On the fourth turn, I felt the steps get faintly damp, as if the tower had been sweating. On the fifth, I realized I had miscounted landings, not from distraction, but because a landing had happened twice. Same oil stain like a map, same scratch on the wall, where somebody had dragged a ladder. I stopped. My breath came back at me too slow. Far below, the museum's entry bell rang once. A visitor. I tried to go back down. The room I reached had the same draft and the same note in it, only a shade lower. The logbook on my arm hummed the way paper does when you rub a finger over a written line you didn't write. I opened it because there was no not opening it. New words waited on the line I hadn't looked at yet. Steady as a tide, he will go down the stairs and not reach the bottom. I wanted to tear the page out. I reached to do it and found my hand had stopped just shy of the paper, hovering like there was heat coming off the sentence. The spiral below me threw the sound of a step that wasn't mine. There is a rhythm, you know, if you've ever had someone follow you on stairs, how their footfalls shift into yours, then away, not in sync, deliberately not. That rhythm echoed up from below, dry as shoes on belt metal. I kept going down because I had to choose a direction, and that one felt like defiance. The tower cooperated, then didn't. I marked a landing with a smudge of my glove on the wall, a little white arc. 3 turns later, the same white arc waited. I put the book on a step and took one more flight without it, counting out loud. I reached a landing, and there the book sat, open, on the step, as if it had come along anyway. It had added nothing except a date. Behind the date, there was a scrawl not in the keeper's hand, newer. An entry I had not seen that morning when I took the glass off. It wasn't my handwriting either, but it had my impatience in it. Weather fair. Visibility good. Volunteer present. He will not make the bottom today. June. I called, letting my voice go ugly and big because the book had been right. I didn't like the sound of it. It came back to me from 3 places that aren't in the tower too near, too far, and inside my chest. I made myself sit on the outer edge of a step, like a person on a bus bench, book in my lap like homework. I don't remember standing up again. I remember the museum door opening, and June's voice somewhere I couldn't have put my feet to. I remember the sound of a page turning in a room without a person in it. I'm telling this now from my kitchen table. The lighthouse is across the harbor in the window, so familiar it almost disappears. The logbook stayed behind under glass because I put it back with careful hands and locked the case and handed June the key like an adult. That is the truest version of events I can prove. And yet, the last step of my apartment stairwell takes longer than it should. My phone's notes app grows new lines when I look away. Yesterday, the blank on my grocery list had a sentence in narrow brown ink no pen I own could make. It wasn't wet. I rubbed my thumb over it and nothing came off. He will go down the stairs and not reach the bottom. We were sure I was alone on the catwalk. The photo put a hand on my shoulder anyway. I started volunteering at Lockhart Light at the end of tourist season, when the air goes thin and salt tries to sting in your nose. It was me and my friend Mara that Saturday. Closing procedures, wipe the lens, check the gallery bolts, secure the exhibits. The museum coordinator had a habit of reading the rules like a spell, and her favorite line was, "Chain the outer door from the inside. It stays chained." The door she meant is the heavy steel one at the base, the only exterior entrance. You step in, pull the chain through a welded eye, drop the padlock, and it becomes a little world with no exits. You can't unlock that from outside. We made a point of rattling it hard before heading up. The sound went up the shaft like a coin down a well. The tower was its usual cold, the kind that sits over your knuckles. Our steps echoed in a way that always makes your mouth go quiet. The lantern room smelled faintly of old oil, and perhaps imagined smoke, as if someone had just put a lamp out. Outside, the catwalk wrapped the glass like a thin belt. Gulls hovered at our height and gave us narrow looks. "Hold still," Morse said, grinning. "You look serious." "Do the stern keeper pose?" I rolled my shoulders against the chill and leaned lightly on the rail. Rust was coming back through the paint, freckling the metal. Far below, the water made the small, greedy sounds it makes against rocks on a falling tide. I looked toward the point where my dad used to set traps, because I always do. Something cold pressed my jacket there, just enough to make fabric shift on skin. The kind of pressure you'd mistake for wind, except the air was windless. "Okay," Mara said. "Phone up." "Got it." We did the rest by the list. Plot the lens gently, check the glazing, make sure visitors hadn't carved their initials into history. We spoke, but softer than normal. People do that inside places that make their own weather. Down we went, spiral by spiral, warming a little at each turn. At the bottom, I tugged the chain again. Still tight. The padlock looked like it had not been unclipped since the Hoover administration. Through the peephole's glass I saw only our reflections, ghosted by sea haze. No fresh footprints on the entry floor. No one had come in. No one had gone out. It wasn't until later, at a table in the empty gift shop with the humming fridge, and the sun deciding if it would set red or clean, that we scrolled through the pictures. The one on the catwalk wasn't special at a glance. Me half-turned, mouth soft with a stupid almost smile I didn't know I had, the horizon a gray seam. Then we pinched to zoom. Behind my shoulder, very close, stood a second figure. Not Mara. She had the camera. Not a tourist. They'd have had to pass us to get there. The hand on my shoulder was pale and neck-long, each knuckle too flat, the pad of the thumb pressing exactly where the cold had touched me. You could read weight in the flattening of the fabric. The figure's head was slightly bent, as if smelling my hair. The slicker they wore, if that's what it was dark and wet-looking in a way that didn't reflect light correctly. Where the face should have been, the lens had caught something like a glare inside glass, as though the person lived behind a pane I couldn't see. "Okay," Mara said, voice too bright. "That's an artifact." "He's touching me," I said. It came out like a diagnosis. We backed up to the beginning and scrolled again, hoping the picture would be normal the second time through. It wasn't. In the next shot, a burst Mara had taken by accident, the hand looked less like a grip and more like a suggestion, the hint of fingers threading themselves into the seam at the jacket's shoulder. In the live photo, when we held our fingers down, the frame moved a breath's worth. Nothing dramatic. My head tilted a fraction, a gull slid past, and from behind the phone's tiny speaker came 3 slow clicks, like the sound of a chain walking through an eyelet. Mara. My own voice, recorded under the photo, sounded like it wanted to stand up and leave my throat. "The door was chained." She nodded, lips pressed white. "We chained it." We tried to explain it the honest way. Someone had been in when we arrived. We hadn't checked every room thoroughly. Somewhere, a side door exists. We walked the rooms again with that electric feeling the skin gets before a storm. Storage closets, model ship gallery, the sad diorama of a keeper's bed-thin mattress, Bible folded in half. Nothing. Air as still as a held breath. The chain on the outer door lay in its loop exactly as we'd left it. I pulled it, and it gave a tiny, ungenerous clank. Back up top, the catwalk smelled suddenly like wet rope and a pot left on a low flame. The hair along my neck prickled the way it does when you discover someone standing close in a mirror. I went out anyway, because you'd rather see where the bad thing could stand than imagine it everywhere. "Don't," Mara said, already recording. Just don't. The metal under my boots felt warmer than the air, like a radiator that's been on for a while. I put my hand on the spot where the photo showed that pale grip. The fabric there had a faint dent it shouldn't have had, as if fingers had softened the fill. When I took my hand away, 5 moisture ovals matte salt fog shapes loomed on the nylon and then vanished. Far below, the tide slipped a little harder at the rocks, and I had the sudden and unkind thought of someone below us, on the inside curve of the tower, keeping pace. We left with our voices turned down to the sizes of the rooms. The night afterward pretended it would be ordinary. I went home, showered too hot, left the bathroom fan on for the noise. When I peeled my shirt off, my shoulder showed the faint bruised suggestion of where a hand would have been if a hand had ever been. Not distinct, not enough to prove. Enough for me to touch and decide privately that I could feel the exact width of a thumb. The next morning, Mara texted 3 images without intro. Screenshots. In the People album on her phone, a new face had been detected. It was a glitch. It said, a partial profile. The tiles showed little gray ovals where eyes and mouth should go. Machine guesses. The last tile was the catwalk shot. Her phone was asking if she wanted to add this person to the album, as if we knew them. She followed it with a photo, ID forgotten, she took. The chained door at the base, timestamped 1 minute after the catwalk picture. The chain lay in the eye, padlock showy and inert. No prints on the fogged glass. No blur of anyone leaving. I went back to Lockhart 2 days later because my brain wanted to set this somewhere not in my house, not in bed. A tower in morning light looks harmless, like a thermos. Inside, though, sounds from your own feet fall weird. Halfway up, I smelled that low flame smell again, like warm dust and oil. On the 3rd landing, the chain sound came without a chain, a faint traveling clatter that moved up the stairwell to meet me, and then kept going. At the lantern room I stopped. The catwalk gleamed. The ocean had gone gunmetal. In the glass I saw what looked like the reflection of a man just over my shoulder. Not in the room with me, but in the window between us. He didn't move. I did the smallest thing I could. I lifted my phone and framed the empty rail. When I checked the screen, the preview showed the curve of the catwalk and my own shoulder, soft with morning light. And on that shoulder, where my jacket wrinkled, there was the shadow of a hand that should have been mine or Morse, but wasn't. The outer door rang then, faintly from the bottom, a chain noise with nowhere to be. I have that photo. It doesn't smear or shift when you reopen it. It makes no new sounds. The chain at the base still drops into its eye just like before. The door is still secured from the inside. That's the worst part. You can close a door so well that nothing living can come or go. That doesn't mean you're alone on the catwalk. The radio knew my last name before I said a word. The sea already knew exactly where I was standing. King's Head Light sits off a rock spine. You can walk at low tide if you don't mind cold water in your boots. I do odd hours there, painting railings, swapping exhibit placards, making sure teenagers don't leave initials in the lantern room. On nights when fog beds down and the bay goes quiet, I keep a handheld radio on my belt because it makes people feel like someone official is listening. Midnight had that refrigerator hum to it. The lighthouse smelled like pennies and old oil and wet wool from the coats on the visitor hooks. Somewhere, a buoy bell ghosted the fog. I was labeling new photos for the display on the vanished keeper. Name of the man, date of the disappearance, vague paragraph about lost in heavy weather, when the radio at my hip crackled and then got very precise. Not voice, not the usual harbor chatter. This was dots and dashes, clean and old, like a metal spoon tapping a jar in a rhythm, too determined to be random. I know enough Morse to recognize SOS in my own last name. Harlow, ... dash, and in the same heartbeat after, Dot 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 dash dot dash dot dash dot dot dash. Not a call sign. Not a channel number. My name spelled out like a thumb walking an old key. I set the photo down. The fog made the windows into empty bowls. The radio clicked again, and numbers came through fast, twice. Latitude and longitude I could read even without a pencil. I pulled my phone out with hands that didn't feel like mine and checked. GPS. The coordinates on the screen matched the radio exactly, down to the seconds. It was one of those movements your stomach makes when the world goes from coincidence to I don't know where to look. Station, this is volunteer at King's Head, I said on 16, my voice a quiet person, trying not to sound like a quiet person. I think I just received an unknown Morse transmission. Coast Guard came back professional and drowsy. Volunteer at King's Head, what's your nature of distress? No distress, I said, which was only partly true. It spelled my name and gave my exact position, in Morse. There was a pause while somebody probably raised an eyebrow at someone else. Say again? I repeated it, gave the coordinates, which were also printed on a brass plate by the chart like they had been waiting there. Another pause. Keys clacked. The radio returned with a different voice now, careful. King's Head, could you confirm current time? 007. Copy. Hold your position. We have a log indicating a similar signal was received from that location in 1954. Same sequence? SOS, a last name, then that latitude and longitude. That was the night the keeper at King's Head went missing. Can you confirm your last name? Harlow, I said, and the way the syllables felt in my mouth made me wish I had lied. The radio didn't carry the sound of anyone breathing on their end, but I felt people rearrange themselves. Understood, the Coast Guard said. Stay where you are, Mr. Harlow. Do not descend the structure. Do not enter the tower alone. We're dispatching a unit to your location. Keep this channel clear. It's funny what do not makes your body want. I found myself at the base of the stair anyway, the iron model I have memorized, the steps that count out 2 perfectly. I pressed my palm to the rail. It was colder than metal should be. The whole tower vibrated a sound too low to be a sound, the kind of pressure that makes you aware of your teeth. The radio clicked once without opening channel. I heard dots and dashes again, but not from the speaker. The rail under my hand picked the rhythm up, a spelling through the bones. Harlow. Then, D-O-W-N, I took my hand away. I thought, hard, of doing what the Coast Guard said and waiting in the keeper's office, where there's a coffee maker and a poster of maritime flags that is both boring and reassuring. The stairs breathed a cool exhale that smelled like old rope and lampblack. I went up because not going up felt like kneeling in the wrong place. Halfway, the low-note pressure turned into something you could almost mistake for a mechanical noise. A generator cooling, a lens yawning. The glass above held a faint halo from the town lights, a dull circle that made my eyes feel tired. One kept listening for the radio. Instead, the tower kept answering itself. Dashes thumped in the floor. Dots buzzed in the handrail. Letters formed in my head. I tried to refuse them and failed. Open. A service hatch in the second landing's wall had been painted shut since before I started. The paint on the edges had a hairline crack that, if I'm honest, I'd worried with a thumbnail once or twice while thinking about nothing. I stood with the hatch at my shoulder now. The crack scalloped, almost like the wood had sighed. Station, I said, words doing their stiff walk. What did your 1954 log say exactly? A different, older voice came on, like someone had rolled their chair over at headquarters. King's Head, 1954 entry reads, SOS received in Morse. Single last name. Same lot long. Keeper went to investigate tower. No further communication. You want me to read the last name? I already know what it is, I said, and my throat clicked. Rail buzz, HRLO. I took the hatch handle. It shouldn't have moved. It moved with a damp stickiness like lifting a seal. Cold air breathed out of a gap that didn't make sense given the shape of the tower. I held my radio up to the dark, and the antenna pinged like it had just been touched by weather. I'm not proud to say I said my father's name then, dumbly, like a charm. He taught me Morse on a napkin at a diner when I was 8 because I liked puzzles and because the waitress liked him better for it. He took me up King's Head once, too, back when the volunteers were sloppier and keys seemed like formality. He pointed at the lens and told me about the word fennel, like it was part of knowing how to eat. From the dark behind the hatch, the signal came not through the radio, but through the structure. Dash, dash, dot, dash, 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 dot, dash, dash, dot, dash, dash. RELIEVE. Mr. Harlow, the Coast Guard said, sharper now. We're 15 out. Do not go further. The hatch exhaled like a room adjusting to the idea of company. I thought about the keeper in 1954, how the history panels reduce a person to weather and one bad night. The stair under my feet vibrated a new word that wasn't Morse, not really more like a shape. It felt like someone laying a hand flat on a shoulder. It felt like someone waiting to be told their watch was over. Relieve me, I said, not because I meant to, but because the word wanted air. Everything in the tower went quieter. The pressure left my teeth. The glass above stopped holding its pretend halo and went clean dark, as if the town had blinked out. The radio, for the first time, carried breath. Not theirs, mine, too loud. And under it, a very calm tapping that didn't need a speaker to be heard. Harlow, the Coast Guard talked in my ear. Steps exist in a tower that isn't your tower. A buoy's bell moved through the fog as if it had been lifted and carried. In the hatch, the dark waited with the posture of someone at the end of a shift, polite, steady, tired in a way that isn't sleep. If you're hoping for courage in the shape of a decision, I don't have it for you. I stood there and did nothing, which felt like the wrong thing and the only thing. The tapping slowed. The letters became lazy, suggestive. The sense of someone standing just inside the hatch did not go away. I shut it. The paint scene creased and held. The rail under my hand spelled no more words. The tower returned to being an object. They showed up eventually, boots and lamps and paperwork. We walked down slow together, 3 extra sets of footsteps, and reached the bottom, like people who know stairs are supposed to run out. Later, at the station, the watchstander brought me the old log to see. A single line in pencil, neat, mid-century, SOS, Harlow, King's Head lot long. Keeper descended to investigate. No return. They asked if I wanted to file anything formal. I said I'd deed it back to them, because what would you write that didn't sound like a man looking at his own name on a list and not wanting to give the list more ink? I still carry the radio. Some nights it is a quiet, dumb brick. Other nights, when the fog lays down and the lens on King's Head shows nothing but its own face, I feel the rail thrumming through my palm in a voice older than voice. Careful and patient and unhurried. 3 slow taps, 3 long ones, 3 slow again, and then my name, because it hasn't forgotten. Harlow. The stairs never agree on how many there are. On the night they add up to 66, the lighthouse opens its mouth. I volunteer at Merrill Point Light because it has the kind of simple work that quiets your head. You wipe salt from brass. You check the gallery bolts. You tell school kids not to lean on 100 years of glass. The tower is narrow and cold. The stone gives off a damp that climbs your cuffs and sits behind your knees. The staircase is a tight spiral with iron treads worn smooth in the center and rough at the edges where nobody steps. I counted them the first week for no good reason. 73. The next week, at the same slow pace, I got 71. I told myself I miscounted. It is easy to lose numbers when your breath keeps pushing back at your face and the sea keeps saying its small, greedy syllables through the slit windows. After that, I made a habit of counting. Some days the stairs were 69. Once they were 74. Often they were something in the low 70s that left me feeling like I'd missed a rung on a ladder. I chalked a tiny dot under the lip of the first tread and another under the last, so I had reference points. The dots shouldn't have moved. Twice they did. Once the lower dot was one step higher than I remembered. I told myself I'd put it in the wrong place. I told myself a lot of things because the alternative is thin ice under every step. It was a fog night when the numbers went straight for my spine. Fog turns the inside of the tower into its own weather metal sweats. Rope smells come up out of nothing. Sound folds in on itself. I was alone closing down. The outer door was chained from the inside like always. The padlock teeth bite cleanly and ring once when you drop them into place. I rattled it because I like the finality. Then I started up with the clipboard under my arm and the stupid private ritual of counting under my breath. 1, 2, 3 each step, ticking like a metronome I could feel in my arches. 59, 60. The air got colder at 62, the kind of cold that makes the skin on your wrist feel thinner. 65, 66. On 66, there was a hatch. It wasn't there on the climb up the day before. It wasn't a part of any diagram in the laminated anatomy of a lighthouse poster that hangs in the keeper's office. A square of iron, flush with the inner wall at knee height, with a ring you could hook a couple of fingers through. It had a seam around it like a mouth that had been stitched and then unpicked. I would have sworn on anything there was no hatch in this place. I know where every nick is. I know where the paint blisters like a map of Maine. But there it was, sucking cold into the stairwell. I put my fingers through the ring because curiosity is a muscle that works even when you know better. The hatch lifted on a short, silent hinge. Behind it was not an access space or dry rock or forgotten conduit. Behind it was water, not an image of water, not reflected sound. Black water right there in the wall, lapping at stone in a rhythm too slow for a pump and too hungry for a puddle. It breathed out a smell like old rope, coins, and something that had been wet too long. The little wavelets made that hollow slap you hear when tide sneaks under a dock. I felt the spray hit my face. It was warm. I don't know how long I looked in. Time went slippery. I blinked. The hatch was gone. My hand swung through air and hit iron. The wall was whole. The seam wasn't there. My heart went into a fast trot, and I took 2 careful steps down. Then 3. I looked at my shoes because I felt heavier. They were wet, not a light damp from fog. Wet, with beads standing on the leather and a crescent of grit stuck to the rubber where the tread should have been clean. A drip hung from the lace knot and fell to the iron with a sound that did not belong so high up in a dry tower. I walked down to the gallery level without counting. The air smelled like nothing again. At the base, I rattled the chain and felt steadier seeing it. The padlock sat in its bite like a dog in a kennel. Outside, the fog made the world the size of my hand. I didn't tell the coordinator because even in my own mouth, it sounded like a story you make up to explain why you were shaking. The next night I wore different shoes and left the old pair by the radiator at home. They left a salt ring when they dried. The stairs were 71 again, then 69. I told myself I wanted them to be wrong, so they were. And then, a week later, on another fog night that padded all sound and made the beam a soft white ribbon, I climbed and counted and reached 66 and felt air breathe across my shins from nowhere. The hatch was there. The seam was damp. The ring looked old and finger-smoothed. I didn't touch it. The wall thumped once, as if something had turned in slow water and brushed stone. A little spit of spray ticked my pant leg. I went down fast enough that my clipboard barked my thigh. The staircase misbehaves in more ways than numbers. Twice since, I've started down and found bottom farther away than gravity says it should be. Once I walked past my chalk dot and saw it under the next step down, like the tower had decided where first was without me. The worst was the night I didn't account on purpose and still knew where 66 would be because the metal went colder. The hatch lifted in my head before my hand moved. When I blinked, it was gone, and my socks were wet inside my shoes. I tried bringing someone. It should have solved everything. The stairs were a cheerful 73, with a friend behind me asking if the view was really worth all this. The walls smelled like dust and school field trips. No hatch, no seam. The friend said I needed more sleep and fewer nights alone with long, echoey things. They weren't wrong, but they weren't right. Last night, I tied a line around my waist and the rail because I wanted some proof of thought. I climbed slowly, counting out loud like a person negotiating with a child. 62, 63. The air flowed against my calves, warmer than the rest of the tower, like a dog passing between you and a door. 66. The seam was a wet gleam. The hatch lifted easier. The water inside was black in a way that had texture, like velvet you run your hand the wrong direction across. It slapped stone once, twice, and the second slap had a clap to it like palms. I dangled the free end of the line through the opening because I wanted to be sure I was not inventing. The rope went slack, then heavy, then light. I pulled it back and the last foot of it was darker as if it had been dipped. I blinked hard. The hatch was gone. The rope left a cold mark against my palm. Footsteps sounded below me, the way sound sometimes jumps in a spiral, as if someone else were catching up, or I were catching up to myself. I stood until the cold found its way into my jaw and set my teeth on edge. I've stopped chalking the steps. It doesn't help. I still count, because if I don't, I'll start listening for other numbers. The lighthouse continues to be a polite museum in daylight, and people pose for pictures at the base, arms around each other, saying how it must be nice to work somewhere with a view. It is. The view is why I still go back. Tonight, when the fog presses its chest up against the glass, and the beam finds the same strip of mist over and over, I'll climb again. I'll count because that's what I do. I won't touch 66 if it finds me, and I won't look into anything that wants to look back. My shoes still leave faint salt prints on the gallery floor. Sometimes they continue past where I stop. I used to think the stairs were measuring height. Then I thought they were measuring my attention. Now I think they're counting something else. Every time the number drops, the water is closer to wherever I'm standing. Last night, I reached 65 before the breathing started. I blinked, and it shut. I don't know what happens if I run out of blinks. The shadow moved, but nothing in the room did. The dead lens watched me without turning, and something paced where no one stood. I took the evening shift at Weatherby Light because I liked the silence of clean glass and old metal. The museum closed at 5. The last family trailed back down the spiral with their damp sneakers, and questions and left me with a checklist and the kind of quiet that has a weight to it. The lantern room is at the top around of brick and salt and ringed crystal. The Fresnel lens sits like a crown, tier on tier of prisms, each one dull with age and museum lighting. The rotation gear has been locked for decades. The clockwork weight is disconnected and tied off. It's a relic. It's supposed to be a relic. Fog pressed up against the panes, the kind that makes distant horns sound close to your teeth. The lantern room smelled like cold brass, and the ghost of lamp oil from somewhere it had soaked into wood 100 years ago. I checked the bolts, dusted the visitor finger streaks from the outside of the glass with a lint-free cloth, and tried not to blow fog breath on a lens that doesn't light anymore. That's when the shadow started going around the walls. Not a beam. Not light. A shadow. The absence of it, blacker than the gray room, circling, steady as a man walking around. It crossed the brick in a band, the width of a shoulder. It slid over the placard about Augustin Jean Fresnel, pronounced Fren E-L-L, across the framed black and white of the keeper in his pea coat, over the door, then around again. If the lens had been rotating, if some bulb had been burning, the room would have been full of moving reflections. But the prisms were dead, and the light was dead, and still my shadow had company. I turned to catch it head on, and found nothing but my own shape, bent crooked by the curvature of the glass. When I looked back to the wall, the shadow paced on, precise, unbothered by my attention. The hair went up along my forearms the way it does when you a kid. And a dog stares at a corner of the room, and you can't make it stop. I checked the catwalk. The outer door was tight. The fog had swallowed what little horizon there was, and left the wet sound of the sea clapping rock when it felt like it. No gulls. No passing boat to throw a trick. I came back in and stood in the middle of the room, waiting for the simple thing that would explain the silly thing. The shadow rounded again. It didn't touch me. It never touched me. It kept exactly a foot from where I stood, keeping pace with a man who wasn't there. There's a hand crank under the lens, ratcheted into a gear train that used to drive the rotation with a suspended weight. We keep it there like a display, a demonstration of how you wound the light. Please do not operate, the label says, and people always smile at that. I put my hand on the crank, not to operate it, but to have something to do with my hands besides clench them. The metal was colder than the air, by a degree that made my palm ache. The room felt smaller then, as if the fog outside had thickened and pressed through the glass to thin the air. On the wall, the shadow slowed. The kind of slowing a person does when he checks his pocket watch and adjusts his stride to an invisible schedule. All right, I said, to myself or the tower. All right. I nudged the crank. It didn't move. It shouldn't move. The gear was pinned. I wasn't trying to turn it. I was testing like towing a step to make sure it's there. The shadow passed over the door seam, and for a blink, I saw the brick beside it go darker, as if something had leaned there and listened. I wrapped my fingers around the crank to push harder. Something rapped back. It wasn't a jolt. It wasn't dramatic. It was the feel of another hand, taking the same bar from the other side skin colder than metal. A strength that didn't squeeze so much as rest confidently into mine. The pads of fingers aligned with mine through iron. I felt the shape of a thumb searching the groove at the base of my own. The oldest part of my brain wanted to let go and throw up and run all at once. My hand did nothing. My hand belonged to the crank and to whoever else did. A sound began in the gear low, regular, not turning, not grinding, breathing. The shadow on the wall sped up half a step. I tried to pull away, and the hand held me, not hard, not cruel, just a refusal as polite as a doorman who will not let you go into the wrong room. The crank tugged. The gear teeth stayed still, but I felt motion in my bones, as if the crank was a handle on something that could move without moving the machine. Let go, I said, and heard the way my voice made its own echo, not from the room, but from the inside of my skull. It did not let go. A second hand settled lightly over the back of mine. The pressure was delicate and terrible, like being corrected by someone who has taught a lesson so many times he's patient, even with the worst student. The crank guided my wrist for refraction, then back, a slow, useless winding that persuaded nothing to turn. The gear made a tiny, once every 2 seconds click in sympathy and never advanced. Bootsteps took up in the shadow on the wall. That's the only way to say it. I heard the heel and toe of a man pacing, the soft scuff at turn points, the pause every time the shadow crossed the door. The smell of warm oil came where no lamp burned. A drop of condensation ran down a prism, like a tear, and left my face doubled and tripled, and bent in a dozen little pieces across the wet. Who are you? I asked, because questions are what we have when we have nothing else. The crank answered by tightening its borrowed fingers, a little nod, a squeeze, a reminder. The hand on my hand was calloused in the places rope will do. My palm began to numb. Cold climbed the bones of my forearm as if drawn by a cord inside me. The outer door clicked then, not open, not rattled by wind. The chain in its eye settled a link lower with that traveling metal sound a chain makes when it decides where it lives. I said my own name out loud to make the room know me. The pacing never stopped. The shadow never missed a step. I thought about dropping to the floor, about twisting and putting a shoulder under the crank to break it, about 100 brave things that dawn to happen when you in the middle of them. My fingers did the opposite. They interlaced with the cold through the iron bar, as if returning a courtesy. Relieved, I said, without meaning to. The word came from my throat the way air leaves a tire. Slowly, because that is the only way it goes. The room listened. The breathing in the gear quieted to almost nothing. The shadow slowed until it was only the idea of a man about to stop. The hand on mine loosened, one finger at a time, not leaving, not staying. The crank felt like metal again. I pulled my hand back and found my glove creased where fingers had not been. The skin under my palm burned in a way that would not warm. I didn't run. Running in a circle is a comedy I wasn't interested in practicing. I walked to the door, watched my shape bend in the glass, and made myself look at the chain. It was in the eye as always. It looked wrong by one link, lower or higher than it had been when I came up. I don't know which. The fog outside pressed its face against the pane and left nothing but my reflection to argue with. I go back because that is what I do. The checklist still says, wipe glass, check bolts, secure exhibits. The lens still won't rotate. When the fog lays down heavy, the shadow still takes its quiet laps around the brick and crosses the door on schedule. And if I rest my hand where the bar lives, the crank is sometimes already warm with a cold that wants company. At home, the ceiling fan clicks in a rhythm that isn't electric. The bathroom mirror shows a bruise along the base of my thumb in the shape of a thumb not mine. When I close my eyes, I feel the tug forward and back, a winding that turns nothing and asks for everything. Some nights I hear the chain in the dark settle one link lower. The room is ordinary, but the pacing goes on, patient and precise, as if something is waiting for a hand on the crank to agree that the watch never ended. The glass wrote my name in salt before sunrise. The morning it wrote my address. It added one more word, lower. They moved Harrow Point Light inland a mile after the bluff started eating itself. I helped because I'd grown up under that beam, and because the idea of a lighthouse rolling down a county road on a flatbed felt like a magic trick you shouldn't turn away from. It sits now in a concrete pad above a soybean field, lonely as a ship in a parking lot. No surf, no spray, no reason for the windows to crust over on the inside with fresh salt every dawn, and yet they do. It started as a curiosity. The first week, I'd unlock at 7 and find the lantern room panes filmed with a white, fine grit you could write your name in with a finger. It tasted like the air at the pier, sharp, briny. If I breathed on the letters, it went slick and smeared like frost. I wiped with distilled water, soft cloth, moved on with my checklist. The next morning, the film would be back, thicker, coalescing in lines that were almost, but not quite, words. My brain saw what it wanted. Tide, stay, open. I stopped mentioning it to the docents because they smiled and said humidity does tricks. I set a dehumidifier in the stairwell anyway. It filled with clean water that did not smell like the ocean. I taped every window seam with blue painter's tape to humor myself. It made no difference. The salt formed on the room side of the glass, like breath that had slept there, and only condensed when the sun came. On the fourth morning, I found the panes quiet until I breathed. One exhale and letters appeared as if my warm air woke them up. A single line on the east window, grain bright, angled so the light snagged on each crystal like thread in fabric. Hello. I breathed again, and the L's slid, left a streak, and underneath the smear, new grains had already arranged themselves, the crossbars crisping out of nothing. I took pictures. The photos showed the words, and they didn't. Then they did again, as if the files were catching up with what my eyes had seen. When I wiped the glass, the cloth rasped like sanding a painted banister. My fingertips were sticky with salt for hours. I could taste it behind my teeth. The morning with my address was colder. I could feel it before I unlocked the base door. The cool that is lives in stone traveling up through the soles of my boots and into the arches of my feet. The air inside the tower had that coin smell old buildings hold on to. Up at the top, the east and south panes were scrawled edge to edge. It wasn't random now. It was a hand that knew its way around a pane. The crystals had grown into a thin relief like embroidery. My street, my building number. The apartment letter, crooked like the person writing it couldn't quite remember whether it slants. And then the word in taller strokes, bristling with light because the grains caught the sun. Lower. I didn't breathe. The cold found my wrists anyway. I lifted my phone to take a photo with steady hands and managed to fog the corner of the glass. The corner I breathed on smeared, and the crystals there skated down like a tiny avalanche. And under the melt, a new word stiffened into form so fast. I thought I was imagining it. No. I locked up so carefully that the chain on the outer door seemed to listen. Outside, the soybean leaves still shone with dew in a way that had nothing to do with the sea. The highway hummed a steady inland hum. I drove home with the taste of salt in my throat, and my shoulders lifted like a person walking under a low branch. The building's front hall smelled like dust and mail. On my doormat, where there should have been grit from the parking lot, a faint ring of white had formed like the splash line of a spilled drink. I pressed a finger to it. Salt, not plaster. My heat kicked on with a long sigh. It blew cool for a beat, the way old vents do, and in the first breath out I heard something under the air, like water, slapping stone one quiet, hollow clap. Lower what? I said to an empty apartment. The word felt ridiculous with daylight on it. Blinds? My guard? My voice? A bead of moisture had formed on the inside of my bedroom window, tight and clear as a drop caught in a spider's silk. It swelled and then thinned, leaving a hairline of salt behind in its path. Letters built themselves around that strand, grain by grain, confident. LOWE my breath marbled them without trying. Under the smear, the crystals rearranged, a new word knitting itself in the wake of my interference. Basement. I don't have a basement. The building does. Concrete room, washers, a chain-link corral for storage. I pulled on my boots because doing nothing felt like standing in the road, admiring the truck that's about to hit you. The stair down was a little colder than it should have been. The fluorescent light buzzed, then steadied. In the corner by the hot water tank, someone had left a beach cooler with a broken hinge. Its lid was crystal-crusted like driftwood. Granules had dusted a line on the floor, irregular as a tide mark. I scraped them with my fingernail, and the sound hurt my molars. On the far wall, near the floor, a seam of cinder block was furred with salt, like a line of frost beard. As I watched, the fur thickened. Letters sprouted up and made themselves be read. CLOSER. The concrete under my boots gave a little, not like something shifting like a diaphragm moving. A slow inhale. The faintest suggestion of a current pushed cool air past my ankles. When I knelt, my jeans wicked damp for nothing I could see. I put my ear to the cinder block, because in some part of your head, a voice says, if you listen, the thing will explain itself. Behind the wall, Far and not far, water's old sound practiced itself. Slap, draw, slap, draw. In the beat between those sounds, something moved, not big, not small. The same cadence you hear when someone is turning in bed in the next room, careful not to disturb you. I backed up until the back of my jacket found chain link. There was salt on the back of my tongue that hadn't been there a minute ago. I left the basement light on too long because I couldn't make my hand know the switch. Upstairs, the sun had moved. The bedroom window letters were gone. But when I looked sideways, the low angle caught tiny grains still marching in the smear, stubborn, determined, spelling something that hadn't finished. That night I taped my vents and put a towel at the bottom of the bedroom door and slept on the couch without sleeping. The radiator clanked and then took up, 3 clinks at a time, like a buoy bell knocked out of rhythm. Around 4, the glass over the sink fogged on its own, a square of condensation with edges you could have drawn with a ruler. Letters budded within it, quick, a gardener who'd been waiting just outside. Lower SI and K, I shut the drain. The stopper lifted a hair. Water in the U-bend whispered like breath. I still open the lighthouse at 7. The windows are crusted when I arrive. Every morning a new message in a language I know too well. Sometimes it spells other addresses I don't recognize. Sometimes it writes a single word and waits for me to breathe on it to change. The docents say the commute must be nice. This morning, the crossbar of the A in my name had grown thicker than the rest. I didn't think anything of it until it fell on its own in a clean diagonal, like a tilted mark across a target. In my kitchen, the salt ring on the doormat was damp again, as if someone had stood there too long. On the bedroom glass low, nearly at pillow height, where the pane is always the coldest, 4 letters keep coming back no matter how clean I make it. Lower. We saw a man in a yellow slicker waving from a room that shouldn't have had anyone in it. By the time we hiked out to thank him, the only welcome was the slow drip of water from coats that hadn't been worn yet. It was the morning after a storm that smeared the horizon into one long bruise. My friend Eli had brought his drone, because that's what Eli does, flies the coast, like it as a model set, only he has the controller for. We stood on the headland where the path to Greystone Light begins. The lighthouse sits on a black finger of rock you can reach at low tide if you pick your steps and don't mind wet ankles. It's been shuttered for years. The town calls it dangerous, no access. The chained door at the base is practically a local landmark. Eli sent the drone up into leftover mist. On his phone screen, the sea looked flatter than it ever is. The lighthouse rose out of it like a thing that had learned to float by holding its breath. The shutters over the lantern room windows were slatted metal, bolted. We idled the drone around the crown. That's when the man appeared. He was behind the slats, half visible through gaps. A shape more than a face-yellow slicker, creased dark with wet, one hand lifted in a steady human wave. Not a stuck pattern, not a gull trick. A wave that tracked the drone's lazy orbit. Someone's up there? Eli said, like he was asking me what the ocean thought about it. He tipped the drone's camera just enough to see the entrance at the base. The chain was in place, big links through an eye welded to the door. You could see the padlock's squared-off jaw. No way. The drone's mic picked up only wind and the tiny hum of its own motors. The man's hand kept moving, palm out, patient as if we were already late. He didn't beckon. He waved. There's a difference, and my body knew it. We hiked because you don't ignore someone waving in a place like that. The tide was slack enough to show the cross-hatched path of stones. Each had the slick of things that prefer you fall. Wind scraped cold through the holes in my jacket cuffs and smelled like kelp torn up and left to rot politely. The lighthouse's base door looked worse up close paint, turned to fish scales, rust bleeding down in tidy tears. The chain lay just as we'd seen on the screen. I rattled it and felt the shock in my forearms. A padlock gave nothing. Maybe a caretaker went up through the gallery, Eli said. He didn't believe it. We circled. All side doors were bricked. The catwalk was unreachable from outside without a ladder or wings. In the lee under the stairs where wind dies, the air turned warmer by a degree and smelled like wet wool, old lamp oil, and something that had been kept damp in a small room. "Hello?" I tried, at the seam of the door. Sound came back tired from traveling through metal. From up inside the tower, far away, and then not, we heard drip, drip, no other reply. We gave up after a while, because giving up is another way of saying we ran out of ways to pretend we knew what we were doing. We started back along the stones. Halfway, a gust bent us and shoved my hood sideways. When I looked back, for no good reason, the lantern room was a blank set of shutters. I told Eli to bring the drone in. On the screen, as the drone bobbed and returned, the man in the slicker still held his hand up, still waved, still faced the camera like manners were the last thing he owned. We should have left it at that. We didn't. The next day at low tide, we took bolt cutters because Eli is the kind of person who thinks no access means prove it. The chain was cold enough to bite even through gloves. The cutters chewed and stalled and then gave all at once with a sound like a cough you don't want a doctor to hear. The door swung inward reluctantly and exhaled cool, wet air that carried the clean, coin smell stone gets when it never fully dries. Inside, the spiral swallowed our steps. Eli used his phone light. My breath brushed my face and came back salt. The lantern room door at the top had been screwed shut from the outside with a dozen bright, new screws that looked wrong and all that old. We didn't try them. We didn't need to. The drip we'd heard yesterday was louder up here, rhythmic, slow, the kind that goes on long enough to become the clock of a place. The source was a wooden rack along the wall, waist high. Oilskins and slickers hung there shoulder to shoulder, old-fashioned cuts and modern ones mixed, yellow and green and black, all wet. Not damp beating wet, steady drips sliding off cuffs, off hems, pooling in little ovals on the stone that looked dark even in light. Beneath each coat, tied to the hanger with twine, was a tag, not museum tags, not archival, torn cardstock, pencil, names, dates. We went quiet in a way that meant we were talking very loudly to ourselves inside. I used my finger like I didn't want to smudge anything that didn't belong to me. Hartwell, June 3rd. Prentice, August 12th. A handful had dates from the decade before I was born. More had dates next year, some tomorrow, one today. Each tag's pencil had pressed hard enough to groove. "Okay," Eli said. His voice wanted to pretend this was a prank. He turned a tag. It turned with the weight of wet paper. His tone did a small polite flip. "Okay." On the far end, near the last of the slickers, a tag with my last name leaned against the wood where the drip had soaked it darker at the edges. The date wasn't my birthday or anything I could shrug at. It was a day I recognized only because I'd seen it on the tide chart pinned over my sink this morning. The time next to it was written with a little vertical mark in the 8 that looked like a child S8. It was not many hours from now. "Don't," Eli said, though I hadn't moved. He was right. I should have left. Instead, I reached and touched the coat with my name. The sleeve had the weight of fabric around an arm. Cold went up my finger bones, neat like a thin, precise person walking stairs inside me. 30 seconds later, my finger was wet to the knuckle. I didn't know when it happened. "Maybe it's a memorial thing," Eli said, defaulting to logic. "Like, the town put this here for, I don't know, for that storm in '54, or last winter when the—" He didn't finish because the drip changed. It stopped being patient and started being purposeful. 3 drops fell in quick sequence from the cuff of the slicker tagged for today, like a man shaking rain from his sleeve before putting a hand up to say hello. On the wall, above the rack, above our heads, the slatted shutters thinned the light and let it through in parallel bars. In those bars, dust moved like slow rain in reverse. Between the bars, where it should have been dark, a shadow shifted, as if someone had stepped closer to the slats to listen. "We should go," I said, and my voice had the same carefulness I use when speaking to a dog you don't know if you can trust. We made it to the base. The broken chain lay in a tidy pile, as if someone had coiled it after us. The door pulled open fine. Outside, the path of stones back to the headland glistened wrong, like their wetness had intent. We picked our way, light on our feet. The wind had the clean sweep of tide going out, and yet my cuffs stayed damp. At the car, Eli checked the drone footage again, because reality is easier to swallow when it comes on a screen. In the feed from yesterday, the man kept waving the way a person waves from a parade float when their job is to look untroubled. In today, as auto-upload a clip the app had made on its own, there was a new shot I didn't remember us taking. An angle from inside the lantern room. Looking down through slats at two figures stepping through the base door, turning to look back like they were worried the door might close. The angle couldn't exist. The lantern room was sealed. And then, in that same clip, just for a frame, the camera turned to catch the rack of coats and their tags. And my name sat there as neat as ever, pencil grooves dark with wet. Eli killed the app. We didn't talk much on the ride back. I could smell the slicker on my finger all the way home, a mix of fish and something that doesn't come off. I keep looking at that tag in my head. I keep thinking how the handwriting matched nothing I know and everything I recognize. Tonight the wind rose just enough to knock the vertical blinds into each other like cheap chimes. When I closed my eyes, I could see the wave of patient repetition, not beckoning, not goodbye marking time like a man content to do one thing until your manners require you to answer. Tomorrow's date is not special for anyone but me. The rack disagrees. The date on the Driftwood hadn't happened yet. My boat's name was cut into the grain like it had always lived there, and the wood was still wet. They moved the souvenirs to the front of the Harrow Point gift shop, every spring shell bracelets, magnets with little painted waves, postcards of the lighthouse before the bluff gave up on it. The new addition was a shallow wooden bin near the register, filled with smooth driftwood ovals, each one etched with a ship's name and a date. A little sign said, "Wrecked charms found, not made." "Where do you get these?" I asked, picking one up. The carving was simple and clean. The numerals had that shallow look of hand tools. The wood kissed my palm cold and left a faint damp like it had been in a cooler. "They wash in," the clerk said. She was older, the kind of woman who has permanent wind in her hair. First thing, in the mop bucket or by the door, sometimes. We dry them and sell them. Funds for the society. "You mean, literally what? They're in the shop in the morning?" She shrugged like that was the least strange part of her week. "Ask anyone who opens. They'll tell you." The charms had familiar names. Lydia Ann, Sparrow, Nightjar. Under each, a date. Some were from way back, 34, 78. Some were last winter's storm. You could tell people had been buying their tragedies. The bin had gaps around the names everyone knew. I found mine buried under 3 others. Eva June, the name on my transom since I bought her out of a divorce sale 2 years ago. Tomorrow's date under it. The tiny dots from the carving tool still clung to the grooves, dark with wet. I turned it over. A rusted ring of a nail hole scarred the back like an old wound. "That's not funny," I said, "but to who?" The clerk was bagging postcards for a tourist, not looking at me. I put it back. I told my hand to walk away. My hand kept turning the charm. "You all right?" the clerk asked without looking. When she did, her eyes flicked down and then away in a movement that knew the answer. "You can put it back. Somebody could be..." Making these, I said. Sneaking them in, right? People, and I say this with love, don't just sneak in here before 7 a.m. to make work for me. She tapped the sign with a short fingernail. They wash in. I bought it out of a superstition I pretend I done to have. The idea that if you done touch the thing, that's when it gets you. The paper bag darkened in a thumbprint where I held it. I walked the headland in a weird loop and told myself not to be stupid. I told myself I wouldn't to go out tomorrow anyway, because the forecast had that tight isobar look, and you don't to go baiting the sea when it's in a mood. At home, the charm left a salt ring on the table like a glass. I put it on a dish towel. Later, I moved it to the counter. Later, the sink. It always left a wet mark, as if something inside the wood kept making new water. At midnight, I set it in the oven because that felt sane. At 2 a.m, the apartment smelled faintly of kelp. When I opened the door, steam curled out as politely as breath. The wood looked exactly the same. I didn't sleep. That's an easy sentence to say. What it means is I dozed and started, half dreamed of the gift shop door opening itself and letting the tide into browse. By morning, I had decided I would not get near the harbor. I texted Eli at the marina. Watch Eva? I'm staying in. He sent back a thumbs up and a picture of my boat and her slip, glitter on the water. On my table, the charm had dried to a paler ring and then, as I watched, condensed again. I wiped the table. The trail of my wipe beaded like a windshield. The harbor master called 10. You got time to move the Eva to outer C-19? They're running the dredge and want the inside clear by this afternoon. Of course today, I said, because fate likes schedules. You can leave her on the mooring line overnight, he said. Tomorrow we'll put you back. Tomorrow. I almost told him. I didn't. I'll be down in an hour. The charm rode in my pocket, because where else do you put your fate when you don't want to look at it? The marina had that late morning smell of diesel and sunscreen that always makes me feel like I'm borrowing the day. My line was stiff with salt in a way it shouldn't have been for fair weather. The bilge pump kicked on twice in 10 minutes with a hiccuping cough. When I turned the key, the engine stuttered, thinking about it. I told the boat out loud, like a fool, we're not going out, just over. A strip of fog tore itself thin across the harbor mouth like a veil. I untied and idled across the fairway to the outer slips. Halfway, something tapped the hull one clean knock, then two. Not debris, not a random bump, a knock like knuckles on wood. I didn't look. I put her in neutral. The boat kissed the mooring line on C-19 like it had been practicing. When I bent to cleat off the stern, the charm fell out of my pocket and landed with the flat slap of a hand. It skittered to rest against the scupper. The date carved into it looked darker. The edges looked deeper. I had the stupid sense that someone had gone over the lines with a fresh tool in the time it took me to blink. I left. I went home. I parked myself in a chair like a watchstander and made coffee I didn't drink. The window made a little thunder with the first drops of rain the forecast said we might get, and the wind took up in the gutters like somebody blowing across a bottle. A gull cried somewhere it shouldn't be. At 8, the power blinked and came back. My phone lit with a voicemail I didn't hear arrive. This is Harbor Master. You left your stern line too tight. She's riding funny. Tide's turning hard. Want me to run down and loosen it? I texted back, please, and then I got in the truck because faith without works is just fear. At the marina, the wind had gone to that hard, earnest place where it no longer cares if it impresses you. The outer slips bobbed like somebody's hand shaking. The Eva June lay with her stern, pulled toward the finger, line strung too taut. I stepped onto the dock, and the whole world rolled one way, and then the other. I fumbled the knot and hated my hands. The line came free with a bite of spray across my sleeve. The charm was on the deck where I'd left it, only not. It was tied to the stern cleat with a neat little twist of twine I had not had time to tie. The wet had bled to the edges of the date and made each number look like a shadow of itself. I cut the twine with my pocket knife and threw the charm into the bait locker, because anger makes you do smart things like that. It knocked once against the plastic, then twice. Then, not from the locker but from the hull itself, came the sound of a knuckle rapping wood from the outside. Enough, I said, to the water, to the stupid charm, to my own lack of sense. The wind pushed a sheet of rain under the visor of my cap. The sky had done that flat thing where it looks like it is almost dark, though it shouldn't be. I went home by the long road around the headland, hugging the inland side just to make a point. When I passed the lighthouse, the gift shop lights were on, though the sign said closed. In the window, under the bin sign, on a little easel, someone had propped a single driftwood charm. I pulled over as if I hadn't already done the dumbest thing. The charm in the window was mine, or its twin, Eva June, today's date in a hand that had pressed hard enough to bruise the wood. The grain looked raised where salt still crept in from the letters. I didn't go in. I don't know if the door was locked. I drove home with the sense that if I looked over long enough, the lighthouse would have moved in the corner of my eye to stand somewhere it had no business. I'm telling this at a kitchen table that has a salt ring I can't sand out. Down at the marina, the dredge finished early. They called to say I could bring the Eva back to her old slip tomorrow morning. The charm is not in my pocket. It is not in the bait locker. It is on my doorknob, looped with twine, damp enough that a single drop just fell to the floor and left a dark coin. The date can keep moving ahead a day at a time while I stay in. Boats don't. Tonight the wind is steady and polite. The tide chart on my fridge puts low water just past midnight. The wood on the knob tapped once a moment ago with the soft weight of knuckles. It's a kind of manners to answer the door when someone knocks. The light found me and forgot everyone else. When the power finally died, what it had chosen didn't. I went to the evening tour at Caldwell Point because locals get free Thursdays and because the lens at dusk makes even ordinary people quiet. The docent herded us up the spiral, breath white, shoes clacking, the room at the top smelling like cold brass and old oil. Outside, the sky had that bruised blue just before night really decides. The Fresnel sat in its ring like a glass beehive. The lamp hummed its polite electrical hum. The beam swept, paused, swept steady, old work. I was thinking about the keeper photos on the wall and how all their faces looked too tired to be romantic when it happened. The beam stopped mid-sweep and stayed. It was as if someone had put a finger on the second hand of a clock. It didn't halt on a bell buoy or a ship. It stopped on me. Everything else in the room fell into soft dusk. A clean column of white reached across, leveled out just at my chest, and held me like a spotlight. The prism sent 1,000 tiny copies of me around the ring thin, bleached, sharper than truth. I stepped left. The light moved with me like we were tied. I stepped right. It tracked again, unwavering, as if the whole ocean were waiting, and I was the only thing above it. People laughed the way people do when a trick happens, and they want it to be a trick. The docent said, "Sometimes the servo hunts." We've been meaning to address that, and tapped her radio. She asked someone named Tim to check the bearing. She told me to try the other side of the room. I did. The beam followed. My shadow went long and thin on the wall, a black thing with 2 clean edges. When I lifted my hand, its hand lifted half a second later. When I stopped, it kept moving for half a beat, then caught up with a little elastic snap. It was like watching a badly dubbed movie of myself. "Whoa," a guy in a ball cap said. He was smiling until his kid said, very quietly, "Make it stop looking at him." The hum in the lamp deepened, a tone you feel in your teeth. The docent keyed her radio again. "Tim, can you interrupt rotation? Or kill the lamp and bring it back up?" She looked at me like I was a skittish dog. "We'll just reset it." The light stayed exactly where it was. It had the steadiness of attention that makes a person blink too often. Heat touched my skin in a line, enough that hair on my knuckles lifted. The air around everything else felt colder by comparison. I tried to step out of it and almost tripped because my feet had learned the timing of my late shadow and expected the floor to arrive on delay. Tim must have done something, because the room hiccuped. The hum cut. The bulb went dark with that instant, heavy way modern darkness has, like someone dropped it out of a plane. For a breath, we were just people in a round room at the top of a tower with our mouths open. My shadow kept walking, not like a trick of afterimage. Black stayed black. It moved along the wall in that tall, sharp version of me. The beam had made long legs, narrow head traced against brick and placards, as if there were still a light behind me that only it could see. It took a step and then another. I stayed still. It didn't. It crossed the framed photograph of the 1908 keeper and climbed up over the door seam. The docent made a small sound in her throat that wanted a different room to be in. "Emergency lights," she said to no one. The red at the baseboard came up, mean and useless. It turned the shadow darker. Someone's phone flashed. The picture on the screen showed a smear of white where I was and a crisp, tall black figure halfway around the room where I wasn't. "Stay calm," the docent said, and it would have been funny if the word calm hadn't suddenly felt like a thing with a handle that could be yanked away. She moved to the crank cabinet with 2 careful steps. Behind her, the narrow red glow made all the metal look liverish. My other self, my not self, kept circling. Its delay wasn't a delay anymore. It had own timing. I tried to step into it as it came by, the way you step into your real shadow on a sunny sidewalk to prove to yourself it can go anywhere without you. My foot went into its foot shape. My chest met its chest shape. For a second, the room tilted, like stepping off a curb you didn't know was there. It felt like I had split myself across 2 temperatures. The line down my body where the light had held me cold and grainy, the rest suddenly too warm. The not shadow never broke stride. It went past me, dragging a sensation like someone walking close enough to touch you, but not touching. The child started crying quietly into his coat. The ball-capped dad said, "Okay, we're done," to the room, like it would listen. The docent's hands shook as she worked the panel. The lamp stayed dead. The ring of glass around us took on a gray that had nothing to do with light and everything to do with seeing. The shadow reached the catwalk door. It paused. It did not turn a head it didn't have. But the angle of its shoulders suggested interest in a way that made my skin say get small. Then it slid under the scene and onto the glass itself, across the curved panes like slender ink, out into the fog. You could see it trace along the outside glass, in the red bleed, a tall figure walking a circle, the way people in old movies walk a promenade. "Down," the docent said. She was already herding us to the stair. I took one last look, because I'm not smart. Outside, where the beam should have swept the night, darkness held like a consideration. Inside, my late shadow came back around the arc and paused just beside me. I had the impression of a face turned toward mine, not because I saw one, but because I felt the kind of attention faces make. It raised its hand a fraction, half of a wave, and it did what mine would have done half a second later. Mine didn't. We went down uneven. The red lights made the stair treads look wet. In the keeper's office, the docent locked the door, though there was no one to keep out. Tim jogged in from the generator shed with a flashlight and a guilty look. "Maine's out all up the point," he said. "Sorry, grid thing." He stopped when he saw our faces and didn't ask. By the time we reached the parking lot, night had convinced the world. The top of the tower was a black shape against a heavier black. No moving light, no comfort. The kid pressed his cheek to his father's jacket and watched me like I might do something a person couldn't he apologize for. At home, the ceiling fan made its own little shadow wheel in the last of the window light. When the power cut there, a neighborhood sigh rose a chorus of things stopping. In the living room, my wall should have gone blank. Instead, a tall, thin figure crossed it once, slow, unhurried, crisp as a cutout. It took the length of the room and went into the hallway toward the bedroom, as if reconnecting with a path it already knew. A beat later, I moved not to follow. Just because my body had borrowed the lag, I've learned something about time since. You can switch a lamp off, but delay is a kind of light if something wants it. In the tower, in my apartment, in the reflection, in a turned-off TV, there are moments when a slender version of me remembers it has places to be before I do. I've started waiting to see where I'm going to go before I get there. Sometimes, if I stand very still, I catch my other self at the edge of a doorway, lifting a hand in that slow, practiced way. It isn't beckoning. It isn't saying goodbye. It's making sure I don't lose it in the dark. The first knock landed like a heartbeat in wood. By the sixth, the clock still said 2:17, and the only footprints outside were mine, and a second set facing the sea. I took the overnight watch at Gannett Headlight because I grew up with its beam on my bedroom wall and figured the museum version would be easier to love. They staged the keeper's sleeping room on the second level. Metal bed with wool blankets, a chipped enamel basin, a shelf of dog-eared ledgers, and a wall clock with brass numbers and a cracked face. The placard says the clock was recovered after the '54 gale that took the trawler Sovereign and her crew. It also says the clock stopped at 2:17 A. It's stuck there now, our hand down at the 6, minute hand with its long finger pointing between 1 and 2. I tried to wind it my first night out of habit. The key turned. The spring tightened. The hands trembled like a stalled heartbeat and slid back to 2:17 as if elastic were tied around them. I left it because I wanted the quiet. The light went proper dark around 11. Fog took its time but settled in, the sea doing that soft, greedy suck at the rocks that never sounds like trouble until it is. I stretched out on the iron bed, the wool under me smelling faintly of old soap and a colder kind of damp. Somewhere higher up, the lens made a tick now and then the way glass does when it remembers warmth. At 2:17, the first knock came. It wasn't a ghostly tap. It was a measured human fist on wood. 6 blows, evenly spaced, the kind of patience that comes from doing a job for too many years. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Hello, I said, and the room didn't like my voice. I opened the door because that's what you do when someone knocks, and you are the only someone. The corridor was empty. Stone smelled colder as it funneled toward the spiral stair. The outer door at the base was chained from the inside. It always is. We leave it that way. The padlock rested in its eye with a settled, heavy sound when I rattled it. No one could have come in without brute force and a bad attitude. I stepped outside anyway, onto the short landing that looks out over the granite and black water. The lighthouse throws its own smell out here. Iron, rope, salt hunted up from every pore. Fog made the world small. The beam swept the mist to milk. I aimed my light down and found my boot prints in the wet. And beside them, a second set at the door, a man's prints, heel to toe, planted right up against the threshold, not pointing in at the door like someone who had just arrived. Facing the sea. That's how you know prints here. The toes point to what a body was looking at. Whoever stood there hadn't been asking to be let in. There were no other tracks along the landing. Nothing leading to or from. Just mine going out, mine coming back, and this other pair, rooted and solitary, toes toward black water. By morning, the prints had washed to a ghost edge. The clock on the wall still said 2:17. The little sign next to it didn't mention knocks. It just told the story of weather like history, doing its tidy version of murder. I told the coordinator something I half believed, that kids had come by after hours, that the wind makes tricks. She gave me a look you save for volunteers in bad storms and said, "We get noises. Don't go out on the landing if it's bad." The second night, I set my phone to record. I sprinkled a little museum talc in a thin line across the threshold, because I am exactly the kind of person who laughs at people who do that and then does it. I laid a bit of twine across the chain so I'd know if it moved, because faith is nothing without cheap tricks. I lay on the bed with my boots still on and watched the hands on the wall pretend they meant something. At 2:17, 6 knocks. The twine on the chain didn't stir. The powder didn't puff. The door wood thudded like it had a palm against it. The recording later showed my own breath, the thread noise of the room, and right before the knocks, the air going small. You can hear it. The sound of the sea lowers, just a notch, like the world made space for a person to arrive. I opened the door and shined the light low. My line of powder inside the threshold had a nickname pressed through it, the soft curve of something that isn't weight, the suggestion of a boot heel leaning in without crossing. Outside, beside my print from when I stepped out, the second pair had returned, facing the sea again. Drops glistened in each toe like sweat. I stood inside the doorway and said what you say without meaning to. "Can I help you?" The sea answered with 3 small slaps against the rock, evenly spaced, like a person trying to be polite. I shut the door then, because you have to end a conversation with a door, or it never ends. Back in bed, the wool blanket felt like a body that had been warmed and left. Night 3, the weather went ugly. Rain came sideways. Salt stung in the seams of the windows that shouldn't leak and do anyway. I didn't plan to open anything. I didn't plan to do anything. I sat up at 2:15 because my body already knew the time, the way you know the shape of a word your mouth is going to say. The first knock hit like a handle striking wood. By the third, the clock faced cracked glass, threw a pale sliver of my face back at me that didn't look like mine. On the 6th, I put my palm to the door. Cold went through the wood and into my hand like metal chills skin. From the other side, colder still someone else's palm. Not force. Contact. The pressure was gentle and absolute. The door vibrated once, the way wood does when a big man leans on it. Then the weight withdrew, and nothing stood there but the kind of space that holds shape for a heartbeat after it is empty. I unchained before thinking and opened to fog. The beam cut and never got any closer to seeing. The landing held my tracks and a fresh set facing sea. The old wool of a coat smell passed my face and went out. I didn't follow it. The waves at the base of the rock wore the shape of the dark for me. I checked the phone like it held law. The timestamp froze for a long minute at 2:17 and then jumped to 2:19. In the captured audio, there's a little noise right before the last knock. Not quite a voice, more like an engine far off. A breath pulled through a whistle. You might think I stopped sleeping there after that. But the grant runs this month, and someone needs to be in the building when the weather goes wrong. And I can stand strange things if they tell the same story every night. Now I sweep my boots clean before bed. That way, when I open the door at 2:17, I know my print's by the grit. The second pair still comes, stands, toes toward the sea. Sometimes a third, smaller set presses into the wet beside them, then goes. Once, the powder line inside showed the tip of a toe, nothing more, like a person remembering where inside is. I tried setting the clock ahead by hand. I forced the minute toward 2:18, teeth set, spring creaking. The hand resisted like muscle, and then slid back, patient, to 2:17, as if I had asked it to remind me what time it was. When I leave in the morning, the only prints belong to me, and the pair that face the sea. On days after bad storms, the second set is deeper, heel buried like a man bracing. On clear nights, they are light, almost kind. I understand it less each time. I know only this. At 2:17, the lighthouse remembers what it is for, and someone comes to knock 6 times, because that was the number that meant something. Maybe it was a signal. Maybe it was a habit. Maybe 6 men on a deck looked to a tower and waited. Tonight, the wind has that low thread sound like it's stitching something you can't see. The wool blanket already holds a crease where a body will be. If I open the door, I will not step out. If I don't open it, the knocks will come anyway, 6 of them, measured and human. And in the morning, the footprints will be there. Mine going back in, and another pair planted, toes to the sea, like a man taking his post at the edge of everything. The lens remembered a storm that wasn't there. When I matched its home, the room drowned without getting wet. I take the quiet shifts at Black Gull Light, the ones after the last tour leaves and the tower cools to stone. The lantern room has a smell I like. Cold brass, old lamp oil soaked into wood, too long ago to be obvious. A clean edge of salt that rides up the stair on its own. The Fresnel lens sits like a glass hive, a ring of prisms meant to take one small flame and make it into an insistence. Ours is retired and wired to a polite electric bulb for demonstration, but the gear is frozen, and the old winding weight hangs unhooked like a forgotten bell. There's a thing glass does when you touch it. If you tap the right place, it hums back. Not a sound so much as a color in your bones. The first night I was alone up there, I tapped a knuckle lightly against a prism, and a note came up under my skin thin, perfect, sympathetic. I laughed at myself for feeling childlike about it, and tried again. The note came again, the same pitch, as if the lens had been tuned 100 years ago and never lost its place. On another night, I hummed till I found it. I don't have a singer's voice, but even a bad voice can find a frequency if it sits with something long enough. The trick was not volume. It was matching bringing my note up under the lens's note and holding it there until the 2 or 1 rope. When I got it right, the world inside the glass changed. Outside, the sky was honest dusk. No rain. A flat water that flicked gulls like white punctuation. Inside the lens, in the curve of the prisms, a storm began. Not outside the windows, inside the glass. Black water heaved in there, scaled with silvery chop. Lightning split a horizon that wasn't the one behind me. Cloud shoulders climbed and rolled the way a body rolls when it decides to stand. It had movement. It had depth. It had noise without noise. A vibration that made the screws in the floor tremble and the hair along my arms lift like grass at the edge of a train. The lantern room stayed dry. The storm filled only the reflection. I broke the pitch and it faded like a thought walking out of a room. I told myself I'd miss seen in low light, that the eye loves a pattern. I tapped gently, found the note again, brought my voice up to meet it. The prisms clutched the scene tighter this time, held it steady, not a mirage moving with my angle, but a separate place that had decided our room was its window. Rain streaked over the storm glass, beads trickling down the inside of a curve that wasn't wet. Lightning jumped in crisp geometry with no thunder. Far off, in a wash of pale, a dark, upright dot rocked and reappeared. A mast, and in the nearest facet, so close my breath fogged it a heartbeat late, I saw my own face pounding on the inside of the glass. Not a trick of lag. I stood still. The reflection he did not. He planted both palms against the prism, spread fingers wide, and hammered once, lips open on a word I didn't speak. Then again, harder. Light slid along the ridges of his fingerprints in clean diagonal strokes. My mouth tasted like pennies. I let the note fall out of me. The storm went pale as if lights came on somewhere else, and then the lens turned to clear. The next 10 minutes were me talking myself down in a room that had the decency to stay ordinary. making lists checking the chain on the outer door, touching every bolt on the gallery rail, as if that could tether my head. I came back in and stood with my back to the glass, because a thing you can't see you, right? The lens hummed once on its own, a small sympathetic sound like a throat clearing in a quiet church. I hummed back before I knew I'd decided to. The storm swung up faster, as if I'd saved it a seat. The reflection me returned at once, not frantic now, but deliberate, eyes level with mine, though he was inside a curve above my shoulders. He hit the glass in a slow rhythm. The lens answered under my hand, a rising, tightening vibration as the pitch found me and I found it. The screws in the floor sang in that tiny way metal sings when it wants to be part of something. The entire room seemed to lean toward the inside of the glass. "Stop," I said, not to me, to him. He mouthed a word I recognized, not because I heard it, but because I felt my own face shape it a half-second later. My voice matched his without meaning to. "Please." I broke the note again. The rune steadied. The curve showed only my pale, stupid face and the museum placard about first-order lenses and coastal safety. I left the lantern room and sat on the stair halfway down where the tower's S draft makes its flute note. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough that the skin of my forearms stopped fizzing. Long enough that I stopped hearing a tone that wasn't there. When I climbed back up, the night had decided itself deep, salt black, honest. I set the sign in the doorway, flipped the switch that kills the demonstration bulb, and told the lens out loud, like it was a dog, "We're done." At home, the bathroom mirror steamed when it shouldn't have. Distortion crawled around the edges the way heat does over asphalt. In that border, just for a glance, just long enough to be sure, I saw white water slam up under a window that had no room on the other side of the wall to hold anything. My breath picked up the note without me. I stopped tapping the next night. I put foam under the door so the stairs whistle wouldn't find me by accident. The lens hummed anyway, a single focused syllable when the clock read a time I didn't want to notice. The room did the thing rooms do right before a sound starts. Space collected. The pitch arrived like a string plucked nowhere. The prisms took a first, quiet breath of storm. I held myself quiet. I tried to let the tone move through me like weather. The reflection me pounded once, then leaned his weight into the glass in a way a person does when he knows someone is deciding a thing across a table. He looked older than I feel. He looked like the face a person makes when he finally realizes which side of a door he's on. This is memory, I told myself, trying to be reasonable. It's a film the glass plays when someone sets it off. Except I had never owned that jacket my reflection wore, and I had never seen the scar on that hand. On the fourth night, the lens found the note without me. No tap, no hum offered up for me to meet it. The pitch arrived whole, and the storm came up like it had been stored and was now being poured out. Wind rode the curves inside the prisms in a gallop you could feel in your teeth. The screws in the floor quivered until the threads ticked. The smell of salt sharpened to a bite. My reflection didn't pound this time. He turned his face slightly, as if listening, and then he did the worst thing he could have done. He stepped back. Inside the lens beyond him, a shape moved with the weight of a person in water. Not frantic, not small. The glass bowed a fraction under it from within. The prisms bled light in thin, crystalline lines like a map I couldn't read. He raised his hand, not to me, but to something behind me, perhaps on my side of the glass. The hum thickened. It had breath in it now. "Stop," I said again, because it's the only word people have when they have none. I backed toward the door and smacked my shoulder on the frame because the reflection showed space where the room was not. The storm inside the prisms roared without sound. The other me mouthed something I did not catch for once because my throat did not choose to say it. He hit the glass with his palm one final time, The lens shivered head to toe. The pitch fell out of the air like a rope let go. Night poured back in. I keep the door open now, and the light off when I lock up. It doesn't seem to matter. Sometimes the stair sings a note, and the lens answers without me. Sometimes the bathroom mirror at home carries a seam of white water that slides away when I blink. Sometimes the living room window shows my reflection move a half second before I do, the way a bad connection lags, and the figure inside the glass looks relieved to see me or disappointed I'm late. A kid on the tour yesterday tapped the lens with one fingernail when his parents weren't looking. It answered with the small, eager voice of a thing that wants to be recognized. I cleared my throat and said too sharply, "Please don't touch." He snatched his hand away and looked at me like I'd been cruel. After they left, I stood alone and did not tap. The lens hung anyway. A tiny pitch I felt at the base of my thumb, where a bruise has formed in the exact shape of a thumb, not mine. If I match it, the room will fill again with a storm that doesn't happen. If I refuse, I still see a man in the glass, and he looks like someone who has learned a song and cannot stop singing it. When I sleep, I wake with my hands flat on the cold of the knitstand, palms splayed as if I'd been trying the wrong side of something. I think the lens doesn't store storms. I think it stores attention. I think it remembers anyone who ever asked it to show them what the sea can do. And sometimes, late, when the room tightens and the small pitch comes from nowhere, I hear that other version of me start humming before I do inside the glass, behind the curve pounding once, and then again, as if to say, we are already here. We upgraded the light, and something else turned on. When we killed the power, it kept walking. I'm the contractor who did the retrofit at Breaker as Reach, a pretty way of saying. I took a 19th century lantern and gave it the kind of light you see in refrigerated aisles. The town wanted efficiency, fewer service calls, no more burnt halogens. We installed a ring of bright LEDs inside the old Fresnel, wired new drivers, cleaned contacts that hadn't been touched since rotary phones. On paper, it was simple. Same rotating carriage, less heat, more lumens. First night, we ran the test at sunset. The lantern room smelled like hot dust coming off new boards. Outside, the sky went slate and the sea took a deeper breath. I threw the breaker. The LEDs came up hard, clean white that made the prism show every scratch. The beam swept on schedule. People on the catwalk clapped because even adults clap when light behaves. "Look," the docent whispered, pointing at the glass. On the catwalk. At first, I thought she meant me. My reflection walked the curve as the ring turned. Then the beam cut past, and a second figure kept going. Tall, thin. Not a trick of doubling. Its stride didn't match any of us. It walked steady around the outside of the lantern room, a dark human shape sliding across the panes, crossing bars and bolts, pausing by the door, and continuing the circuit. When I switched the LEDs off, it vanished. On again, it returned. Same clip, same path. "Someone's out there," a visitor murmured, already stepping toward the door. I stopped him, hand to his chest, because the outer door downstairs was chained from the inside. Had been all day. I'd locked it myself and pocketed the key. We walked the room with phones up. The shadow only existed in the LED light black as cut paper, edges rimmed so sharply it made your eyes water. In the dim between sweeps, nothing. In the beam, the figure walked on, unbothered by our attention. I killed rotation. The carriage quit. The beam held still across two panes. The shadow didn't. It continued to move at its own pace, crossing into the lit area, crossing out, as if the light were its floor, not its source. Back at the panel, I threw the main off, the thunk you feel through your forearm. Dark took the room. The shadow disappeared. People exhaled the way you do when turbulence smooths out. We chalked it up to reflection, stress cracks in the glass. a weird interaction between old prisms and new LEDs. Everyone had a theory that kept us from saying what we'd seen. The next evening, it was waiting. The moment the LEDs came up, the shape began its walk. We watched its head pass the seam where the panes meet, watched it pause by the crank cabinet as if to check the schedule. I took an IR thermometer to the glass. Cold. I took a voltage tester to the catwalk door. Dead. I opened the lantern room and stuck my head out, breathing damp metal. No one stood there. But when I pulled back, the shadow ducked its head too, like a man giving way in a doorway. Cut power for the night, the coordinator said finally, nerves under her professionalism. We'll troubleshoot tomorrow. I locked the panels, removed the key, and drove home with my truck. Test lights off for a block, because I didn't. Like seeing the tall absence of something paste the inside of my windshield when the streetlights hit. Maintenance pulled the feed the next morning. We yanked fuses, tagged out, bagged the switch, even disconnected the driver, so hard it made my palm tingle. The only light up there would be sunset through glass and the small red of an exit sign. At dusk we stayed to make sure no one messed with the lockout. The sea leveled to iron. The gallery bolts made their settling sounds. We stood in gray. And then, without a source, without a hum, without anything to justify it, the tall shadow appeared on the catwalk and began walking. No beam, no LEDs, just a perfect, darker-than-dark figure crossing the panes, more defined than before, as if the absence of light had gotten brighter in order to be seen. The docent said my name like a question, and then like a prayer. I didn't answer because I was counting 1 circuit, 2, 3. At the seam above the door, it paused again, and the chain below pinned once in the stairwell, the traveling metal sound of a link deciding where it lives. The smell of warm oil bloomed where there was no oil. I grabbed the crank, because tools are what you reach for when you don't have any right ideas. The handle was cold enough to smart. The shadow reached the point in its circuit where it would have been beside me if it were flesh. It didn't look. It never looked. It walked its track like a man who has walked a track too long to need to see it. In the glass, my face hovered pale. Around it, the figure circled, sharper, as if it fed on the LED's memory. I tried to photograph it. The phone turned the room into blown whites and blacker blacks. In the frame, the shadow was cleaner than my hands were. It walked past the cribbing that holds the lens. It passed the "please do not touch" sign and stopped exactly where you would stop if you were checking the skew. For a moment, it lifted its arm. Something entered the room in a pressure, polite and total, the way a theater holds its breath before a curtain. Turn the emergency lights on, the coordinator said from the stair. Her voice snapped like a finger in a mouth. I hit the button. Red washed the brick. The shadow brightened, somehow a deeper cut that made the red richer where it wasn't. A reverse halo. It finished its lap and kept going, faithful as tide. We shut the door and left early with the awful feeling of leaving a stove on. I slept with my hallway light on and woke to a tall shape passing once along the wall in the spill from the bathroom, clean silhouette that made the light look like water. When I cut the switch, it took one more step in the dark before it was gone. We've brought in a vendor. We've logged everything. The town posted a cheerful update about new lighting and historic ambience. People come to watch at sunset. They post grainy videos with captions that treat it like a trick. For them, the figure is less clear. Cameras don't like how it eats light. In person, it is undeniable. A man shape pacing the catwalk on a path he knows better than we do. Only visible when illumination exists. And on the night we took illumination away, more present than ever. Tonight the panels are still open and tagged. I am the only one on site. The LEDs are cold. The lantern room is a gray bowl. As the sun slides, the shape takes its place and begins. It doesn't hurry. It never hurries. It pauses where the door is, where the crank is, where the gallery has always been weak, as if checking what belongs to him. When I press my palm to the glass, the pane hums not electrically, but like an instrument that knows its note. The shadow passes my hand, and for one step, the cold prints of fingers appear on the inside of the glass where mine aren't. We thought saving power would stop it. The next night proved we had it backward. The new light woke something that remembers how to walk a circle. The lack of light only makes it easier to see. My flashlight refused to cross the room. The beam bent around something breathing salt in the middle of the dark. I booked the overnight at Hallowell Light because the brochure made it sound like camping with better stories. You bring a sleeping bag and a sense of romance. They give you the keeper's room and a certificate you can frame. When I checked in, the host, a retired teacher with keys on a bright lanyard, laughed when I asked if people ever got scared. "The light keeps guests safe," she said, tapping the railing like it could hear. "No fires, no candles, flashlights only. Lights out at 10. She walked me through the small museum, past the brass telegraph and the faded chart of shoals, and up the spiral. The tower air had that damp that lives inside stone and makes your cuffs feel cold from the inside. The keeper's room was square, neat and staged. Iron bed, blue wool blanket, a shelf with a chipped basin, a glass front clock that no longer worked. A big window faced the water. The lantern room above hummed with a demonstration bulb. Its bland white spread across the ceiling in a soft geometry. "Chain the outer door from the inside," the host reminded me at the landing. "If you need anything, 2 quick knocks on the office door. Otherwise, enjoy. The light keeps guests safe." She said it again like a slogan, but something in the way she smiled made keeps ring longer than the rest. By dusk, the last tour left. I ate a sandwich on the bed and watched fog gather the horizon into one slow piece. The beam in the lantern stayed off. They only run it on special weekends now. The keeper's room felt like a patient animal. I turned my phone to airplane mode to make the night belong to itself. At 10, the museum lights clicked out floor by floor. The sound settled after, the way a place exhales when the people go. I lay down with my flashlight on my stomach and watched dust float in the cone. That's when I noticed it. The beam didn't run straight across the room. It curved subtly at first, like heat-bending road lines in summer. From my hand, the cone ribboned out and then slipped sideways, skirting the center of the floor as if the middle of the room were a boulder in a shallow stream. Where you'd expect a solid bright oval on the far wall, it split into 2 thin arcs that rejoined beyond a patch of perfect dark. I sat up and pointed it straight on purpose. The light refused to center again, drawing a pale crescent around nothing. I clicked it off and on, a stupid little magic trick for an audience of 1. The nothing breathed when it thought I wasn't listening. In for 4 slow counts, out for 4 the way a tide makes a room feel when it thinks it's alone. Each exhale brought a faint smell of brine that wasn't coming from the window scene. I took a breath through my mouth and tasted salt the way you taste a word that doesn't belong to you. Reflection, I told myself, hearing my voice like it was in a shell. Optics. Bad batteries. Something in the glass. I stood and walked the perimeter with the light aimed straight. Wherever I pointed, the beam arced to miss the middle and brightened on the far side, like a polite dog avoiding a sleeping person. I tried my phone. Its LED did the same, curled around the center, traced a ring. I panned slow and backed the beam against the corner. It made a little halo on the ceiling that stopped tight at an invisible edge waist-high in the room. When I reached my hand toward the center, the hair along my wrist rose as if someone had just stood. My fingers touched it without touching. The air was thick there, colder by a degree that belonged to cellars and caves. A trickle of damp went across my knuckles, warm as breath, leaving a sticky dryness behind. The beam trembled at the edge of the shape and flowed around it like light poured from a pitcher. I lay back down and tried to sleep. Every time my breaths lined up with the slow rhythm in the middle of the room, something in me wanted to match it. The clock on the wall said 9:12, then 9:12 again, then 9:12 like a word, repeated until it stops meaning. Sometime later, a link down in the stairwell chain settled with that small traveling metal sound I've heard on storm days. The invisible shape took a longer breath. My bag on the chair sighed as if weight had settled on it. I sat up so fast my knees knocked the frame. The flashlight rolled. Its cone skated the floor, parted cleanly around the center, and painted the shadow of the bed legs on either side like two black parentheses. "Hello?" I said, not expecting an answer and not wanting one. The room held its breath for me. The window fogged from the inside with a square of condensation, too crisp to be accident. Letters budded out of the fogged patch, neat as a finger writing on cold glass. I didn't have to move closer. Even backwards I could read it. Essified, I breathed on it without meaning to, and the word took a moment to smear. Under the streak, salt crystals formed so fine, you only saw them when the light slipped and caught. For a second the beam carved through them and made a little galaxy. Then it curved and left the center clean again. The host's voice came back to me. The light keeps guests safe. The beam made a careful circle that left enough space for a man to stand. What if that was the shape of safety here? A standing man-sized absence, breathing the sea, something the light learned to go around the way you learn to go around a grave, even when there is no fence. I lay still until the breathing lined up with mine again, and then refused to match it. Outside, a gull made that small night cry gulls make, like an argument with a dream. The room cooled another degree. The invisible thing moved closer, not by sound, not by sight, but by pressure, like weather. My blanket lifted at the corner as if a knee had just not quite touched it. The beam pointed at the ceiling, split in two, and went around a chest-high space that had become part of the bed. I reached for the chain on the door, because metal that bites into an eye bolt feels like a promise. The padlock hung where it should. When I rattled it, the invisible shape breathed out through the room, and the taste of salt jellied at the back of my tongue. From upstairs, the demonstration bulb clicked once, like a throat clearing, and then didn't come on. I tried the radio they leave for emergencies. The speaker hissed like surf. Somewhere in that hiss, for a second, a slow knock 6 times. Patient found the rhythm of the breath in the room, and then was gone. I turned the radio off because listening more felt like standing at the lip of a well and considering what's below. Around 4, the window as fog patch melted and left a lace of crystals that glittered when the beam passed and dulled where it wouldn't. My flashlight felt heavier, as if the cone had to push itself around something stubborn. I lay awake and watched the light redraw its route with each inhale in the center, each exhale, like a lantern at sea learning to circle a rock that isn't on the chart. Dawn made the room honest fast. Gray, then blue, then the ugly but welcome glare of morning. The air went thin of salt. When I swung my legs out of bed, the floor was gritty with a ring of something that scratched faint on the iron. A circle the size of a man's stance was cleaner than the rest. My flashlight beam finally ran straight. For a second, I wondered if I had invented every curve. I packed up with clumsy relief. At the landing, the host was waiting with her lanyard and a styrofoam cup. "How'd you sleep?" she asked, eyes already a little sorry. "Fine," I lied then, because something in me wanted a witness, added, "My flashlight kept bending." "Like there was?" She smiled without teeth. "They do that sometimes. The light keeps guests safe." She squeezed my shoulder in a way that felt like I was being moved gently, out of a line. "You'll be fine once you're off the grounds." Driving away, I tested the beam in the truck cab out of embarrassment I had to overcome with action. It ran straight across my knuckles. It hit the dashboard and stayed obedient. I told myself stories about humidity and uneven glass and tricks of the eye. By the time I got home, I almost believed them. That night, when I turned my bedroom light off and used my phone to find the charger, the little cone of white bent around the center of the room as carefully as if it remembered what courtesy looks like. The air there smelled faintly of rope. I held my breath to hear better and realized that was the wrong way around. The breath I could hear wasn't mine.